You're on the Bible Forum. Do you know what your economic future is going to look like? None of us really know. Doug Casey writes about it, and he doesn't like President Trump. Doug Casey calls President Trump a boobas. He says he's looking at the past, suggesting what is most likely to be our future. He's convinced that we're headed for war. Casey, not Trump. Not with another nation, but a war among ourselves, a war that will change who we are forever. He writes, the U.S. and other governments are printing money in unprecedented amounts. This means, barring war or some situation no one has ever seen, we are staring at a depression on the horizon. Over the last 20 or so years, Americans have been living above their means. We have traded actual debt for monthly payments, meaning as long as we can make the payments, it really doesn't matter how much debt we accrue. Now, that works, but only as long as the bubble doesn't burst. Meaning, I don't lose my job. I don't have to take a cut in pay. Or some event out of my control takes over and the economy goes south. My parents' generation understood this. They lived through the Great Depression. They lived through 2 world wars. The baby boomers, not my generation, but the next generation, the baby boomers didn't get it. And their grandchildren are now facing a potential economic downturn, the likes of which they have only read about. Which means they are about to get an education. And not because of the virus, which is about 90% hysteria, but because the virus is just the pin that broke the bubble. Consumer debt is another way of saying we are living beyond our means. Mortgage debt is the most obvious. A large percentage of Americans have a mortgage far above what they can actually afford. It's called living above our means, and it doesn't take much for that house of cards to come tumbling down. Cars are another illustration. In 1982, a top-of-the-line American car cost anywhere between $4,000 and $8,000. What this meant was that Depression-era Americans could pay cash. Everybody else paid $60 to $80 a month for about 18 months, maybe 24. Today, that same car is about $16,000 and up, a whole lot up. $30,000 to $40,000 for a car is not unusual. And the length of a car loan today can be as much as 8 years. That's if you don't lease your car, in which case you never have equity and you never own a car and you are never without a loan. And Americans have at least 2 cars. If adult children are living with you, that number goes up. With $200,000 worth of debt, some of it unsecured, probably the lion's share, we borrow for education, largely because we think everyone has to go to college. There is no equity involved in this debt. You pay that debt whether or not you receive the diploma or the degree. You pay the debt whether or not you ever either work in your field or ever work at all. I'm thinking about women who get married and stop working. Currently, there are over $1.6 trillion in student loans out. A large percentage of them will not be paid back. Our government has made it possible for you to stop paying and they'll just eventually eat it. And credit card debt will likely be the last crisis to hit. People keep making the minimum payment at 18% as long as possible, and they won't default until the very last minute, simply because they have no further source of funds. State and city debt, represented by municipal bonds, is also a serious risk. Their receipts from income, sales, property, and every other kind of tax are plummeting. And all this just as citizens' demands are skyrocketing. The $1,200 payments the feds are sending out aren't going to help that much, especially since the money came out of taxpayers' pockets. And that's if you've gotten yours. I know at least one person who has. I'm not that person. The $24 trillion debt the government acknowledges it owes is actually dwarfed by the $135 trillion debt from unfunded liabilities, things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. And this doesn't include contingent liabilities from FDIC, PBGC, and similar insurance programs. A large chunk of that debt is held by those nice foreigners who for years sent us Sonys and Mercedes in exchange for paper. Today there's a rush to obtain US dollars because they're cash and not overpriced stocks and bonds. But that's going to not only stop, but it's going to reverse in the near future, resulting in a much lower standard of living for the average American. So what happened? Well, for quite some time now, the United States and much of the Western world has been consuming more than they produce. It's as though you borrowed $1 million simply to support your lifestyle. You enjoy an artificially high standard of living for a while. But when the time comes to pay it back with interest, you suffer a very real drop in your standard of living for a very long period of time. Well, that's what our government and our citizens have been doing for the last several decades. In the 1980s, Reagan and Thatcher and many other leaders around the world delivered fairly significant tax cuts, privatizations, and some deregulation. These things, coming off a very severe recession of the early 80s, resulted in what Herman Kahn correctly predicted would be the long boom. But the boom is over. The question becomes, what's next? Well, what's next came in 2008 when we entered what's called the leading edge of a huge financial storm. It was a huge storm, and it had a huge eye at the center of it. And now we're going through the trailing edge of that storm. It's going to get worse. It's going to get different. And it's going to be much longer lasting than we experienced in 2009, 2010. It'll be worse in the so-called developing nations, which will stop developing without foreign capital. So what can we expect? Well, not only the U.S. government, but the American society itself are bankrupt. And unfortunately, the situation is much more serious than economic bankruptcy. It takes many bad decisions as a consistent pattern to get into the financial mess we see now. And that's possible only by having the wrong moral philosophy. Economic bankruptcy is almost always preceded by moral bankruptcy, and it's accompanied by an intellectual bankruptcy. In this case, the philosophical acceptance of economic collectivism and political statism. America's moral bankruptcy started with a government policy of inflating the currency, which constitutes fraud, if you did it, and running up the national debt, which is an obvious swindle, because you and I both know that debt's never going to get paid. This bankruptcy started with the belief that an income tax was needed. That was in 1918. Needed to level out incomes. But predictably, not by politicians, but by people who know money, it did just the opposite. The exact description of the situation, the author says, is fascism, which, contrary to the History Channel, has essentially nothing to do with police jackboots, bizarre racial theories, or militarism. A fascist is simply one who believes in nominal private ownership of both the means of production and the consumer goods, but with strong state control over both. Fascism wouldn't have had any appeal to the founders of America, who, for a while, fought under a flag that showed a rattlesnake and the warning, "Don't tread on me." What made America different was its foundation on a philosophy of freedom, a word that's been corrupted and leached of meaning, which is another sign of intellectual bankruptcy. America is now economically, morally, and intellectually bankrupt. As evidence, the author says, I offer you the current state of affairs. Bankruptcy is a factual matter. Failing to declare bankruptcy when it has happened only adds to the problem. Germany and Japan were totally and absolutely bankrupt, economically, morally, and intellectually in 1945. Following the war, should they have tried to continue their old currencies, their old policies, ideas, and institutions, they'd be no better off now than they were before. The slate needed to be wiped clean, which it was. As a result, within one generation, they went from being bombed out wrecks to two of the most prosperous economies on earth. Acknowledging bankruptcy is the first step to moving beyond it. Denying bankruptcy when it's a fact only prolongs and worsens that fact. One obvious consequence of these layers of bankruptcy is an increasing reliance on government. Since government produces nothing, anything it even seems to provide is at the direct expense of someone else. This simple fact evades almost everyone, from the most ignorant voter to the most powerful officials. By definition, 50% of the population is less than average in IQ. The average IQ is said to be 98. And they all vote. And it's not hard to figure out how they vote. If their votes were not for sale, there would not be the advertisements we see every day promising things they know are impossible or destructive. What's obvious today is that a greater depression is on the horizon. And the government will, no doubt, come up with something like, a newer deal. Will it work? In the short run, probably, yeah. In the long run, no way in God's world. Hang on.